Welcome to Demming Chronicles Season 2. We go behind the stories. We speak to persons whose opinions and ideas may not be at the forefront, but they're thoughtful and they can help us to solve some of our wicked problems. Today's program, we have Dr. Vindel Kerr.
Thank you for having me, Denise.
Thank you for being with us. And our next guest, Allison Demas. Welcome.
Hello, Denise. Thank you for having me.
And we'll be back shortly to continue the conversation with Dr. Vindel Kerr and Allison Demas. Demming Chronicles, Season 2. Welcome back to Demming Chronicles, Season 2. Our guest all the way from Jamaica, Dr. Vindel Kerr. Welcome to the program, Dr. Kerr.
Pleased to be here, Denise.
Tell me, you are sometimes described as a governance expert. What does that mean?
Well, when someone refers to you as a governance expert, and particularly from the business milieu or at the policy level, it would mean you have had a very deep and advanced grounding theoretically and based on educational attainment, particularly at the doctoral level. More importantly than that, though, to function effectively is at least 10 years practice experience straddling multicultural, multi-jurisdictional, multi-sectoral situations. It cannot be just Jamaica or Trinidad alone. Yes, because you have to operate in the global environment now. And so definitely it comes with grounding, deep grounding in academia, deep grounded in practice, and you must understand from a global perspective the different corporate governance systems and their requirements. In the same vein, the different legal requirements and systems for different companies.
Dr. Kerr, have you had experience across the Caribbean, and would you like to share some of that with us?
Yes, I have had extensive experience across the Caribbean, except Guyana and Grenada and St. Vincent. But I would have worked in Suriname, and I have lived and worked in Trinidad extensively before moving to Trinidad in 2003 and departing last year, 2019, to return to Jamaica. But my tenure in Trinidad was because of the need and for my services to be able to straddle between Trinidad and the other Caribbean islands with ease. As you know, it's not easy from Jamaica. And so I have not only trained just example, more than 1,000 directors of boards in the region and about 500 or more corporate secretaries. And those are in open sessions. I've had more than 100 customized sessions in Trinidad alone among boards in the last 6-7 years. And of course, part of what I do outside of training, we do corporate governance audit and the general governance improvements in terms of codification, etc. So I have also worked extensively in Trinidad, in Suriname, Barbados, and Bahamas, improving corporate governance systems. In Jamaica, I am known to have created Jamaica's first and only corporate governance framework for public bodies. It's a document. Aspects of it will be passed in legislation soon, where all 170 state-owned boards must comply with about 20 main recommendations, many of which have already been implemented or being implemented.
That's quite a rich experience, rich and varied experience. Tell me something. Is there a difference between how board members are appointed in the private sector versus the public sector?
Yes, and just to let you know, the public sector environment, particularly in Commonwealth jurisdictions like most in the Caribbean, each public sector, each government owns at least 7 different legal status of public bodies. So state-owned enterprises, SOEs, they are usually mainly limited liability companies, but they also have the authorities, the commissions, the trust, yes, the fund, and in Jamaica you have a group called executive agencies. They borrow that from New Zealand. So based on the legal status of the company, the Act, Constitution, or Articles of Association that document usually defines how the boards are composed. Interestingly, though, what does not exist in private sector is what you call stakeholder representation. And so most of your authorities and commissions, particularly in Trinidad, Jamaica, etc., the act that created them stipulates from where each director or a set of number of directors should come, so that there is representation, reflection of the society. In the private sector, profit for listed companies, the articles decide and depends on the controlling shareholders. They may just handpick their friends and just anyone.
I want to challenge you, Dr. Kerr, that you say that in the private sector, they may handpick anyone and pick their friends. My observation of Trinidad in particular is that in our SOEs, our state-owned enterprises, that is exactly the model that is implemented. And my observation is that it is not working. So would you like to comment on how ought we to frame the appointment of directors at our state-owned enterprises?
First is a brief clarification, and secondly is the suggestion to reframe it. The first clarification is that the fact is most of our public bodies in Trinidad, in Jamaica, etc., because of the same stakeholder representation, the ministers are limited. So for statutory bodies, most ministers get the chairman, the deputy chair, and a few others. The remaining ones must come from stakeholders. But where the state-owned enterprises are concerned, most of that category, they can be determined if it's 15 or 8 or 6 by the government minister, who, by the way, does not appoint boards. He nominates board. The only authority under the Commonwealth model, is cabinet. Cabinet is the sole authority for appointment, but ministers will determine who he wants or she wants, and he or she takes that slate to cabinet. And if they give him the blessings, then there you go. I have known many situations, though, the entire slate was returned by cabinet based on their knowledge of some of the individuals. Where we should go from here, Denise, is for each of our governments, but broadly, first and foremost, since we have Caricom, we could have what I call a common Caricom corporate governance code, which would be a generic arrangement, clearly defined. Within it, it has the matter of competency requirements for directors, because directors should really be selected based on competence and character. If I get time, I can elaborate those. But under the umbrella of that wide Commonwealth code now, each individual island, state, or country could tweak and make that particular model unique for their different legal, cultural, business systems, etc., so that it is appropriate.
Dr. Kerr, you're talking about that there's a Commonwealth model, and you've suggested that Caricom model could be appropriate. Has any work been done on establishing such a model?
Well, no, there is no current Commonwealth model, there's a Commonwealth model of corporate governance, but not a Commonwealth code. Many countries within the Commonwealth of countries, they have established national corporate governance codes, right? So it is up to each country. And I mentioned Jamaica earlier with respect to the one I wrote. There was an attempt made in Trinidad, the Trinidad Corporate Governance Code. I have written about it there and get into some trouble as well as get some kudos. The fact is, it is still not a national code. It was not initiated by a government. It was a private sector interest group for different reasons, collaborate, and they were able to bring on board a few statutory bodies as well as the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange. And when you read that, it is more applicable to private sector enterprises, that is in Trinidad, rather than state-owned enterprises. So a model of tomorrow must include a detailed competency profile requirements for each company, each public enterprise, because they are all different, as you know. You have the regulators, as I said, authorities, the state-owned enterprises. So the code must be adjustable. Generic form.
In Trinidad, we have two kinds of state-owned enterprises. There are those that are expected to make a profit, and then there are those that simply get a subvention and operate on the basis of the subvention. And my assessment is that we've not been very successful with a number of these boards. What advice would you give with regard to that distinction? As monies continue to decrease and to get tighter, we may not have the available income to fund SOEs. So what ought we to do?
Okay, Denise. It's one of those recommendations I want to suggest to the Trinidadian government, and I have that in a document. Unfortunately, I didn't get the contact. But the truth is, 20 years ago, Jamaica went through a public sector reform. And whilst doing that, they sent a team to New Zealand and Australia. What they discovered is that New Zealand had about 35, or had just reformed and restructured 35 of their state-owned enterprise, and say you are now independent, you must earn your keep. They call them executive agencies, and Jamaica borrowed that. They start with our passport and immigration division, the land division, the company's office, registrars of company, et al. And you know what? Since the reform, all of those 10 are self-sufficient, Denise. They do not have a board, they have an advisory board, each one. And the CEO reports directly to the minister, the responsible minister, and the advisory board is there to advise them, and they meet quarterly. I believe Trinidad and Tobago could benefit. The fact is, in Jamaica, you can get a passport renewed expeditiously in one day, as long as you are able to pay for it. The normal time, the snail mail approach now in Jamaica is 2 weeks after submission, as long as you submitted all the appropriate documents. If you if you find that you are heading to the airport and you have an expired passport and you have to turn back, if you don't have the money for the 24-hour service, there is the 48 or the 3-day or the 1 week. Yes, and it works. Same for customs, same for the traffic division, you know, your driver's license. When I was a teenager, it took me about 2 months after passing the test, just the paperwork, the bureaucracy through government. Now, a young 18-year-old having satisfactorily completed the driving test and his certificate from the driving school will get his license in less than 5 working days, Denise. Yeah?
So that Jamaica has had tremendous reform over a short time. Tell me, and you said that you worked on the New Zealand model. How is that working for Jamaica? Because in Trinidad, people talk about culturally, we can't do these things. Is that true?
No, New Zealand is a Commonwealth country, the same legal system like Trinidad and Australia too. Britain, it's the whole Britain joint stock company and common law. So it works. As I said, they borrowed the approach, tweak it a little bit for the Jamaican context, the fact that we are less endowed with funds, etc., etc. But the truth is, the model also requires you to hire the very best you can find, whether locally or abroad, nationals first, and you put them in charge of those institutions rather than politicizing the role of CEOs, which you know is a common feature within the Caribbean context.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Kerr, as we are about to wrap this interview, give me a few points that you think we could take away to help us to do what we have to do better, because that's the real interest. We do these things in order to improve our countries. What would be some of your suggestions?
Number one, in selecting and nominating your directors, look at the guy or girl who helped you in the political trench. Speaking to the ministers, you go for someone who probably may have a political affiliation, but they are not an activist. Yes, the most important thing, they have competence, relevant skill, qualifications and experience in matching the requirements of that entity. And two, very importantly, character. That is fit and properness, availability, the ethical fabric, compass of the individual, and somebody who is agile and understand that they have to adapt to change. The next one, if you numbered it anyhow, go for more younger folks, younger persons. What I find is many of our directors, no pun intended, they are 60 or 70 or full of experience, etc., but they are behind the learning curve with the latest technologies rather than, for example, papers and folders for boardroom now. They are electronic board portals. So you need the younger blood, so to speak, to become more rapidly adjustable and all embracing. They have the energy to spend longer time, research the company, get certain things done, and to keep the CEOs and the management team on their toes. The last one I want to say, Denise, having lived in Trinidad and like there, the Trinidad government needs to know now that most successful Commonwealth countries have reformed, and part of it is privatization. If you want a more effectiveness, efficiency, and productivity in the public sector, privatize some of the entities, because too many of our citizens of the Caribbean see a public job as an entitlement. They do not perform as they ought to, or the ability they have. They do the minimum to be awarded and move on, and sometimes straddle multiple jobs, Denise. So the government has to correct that and pay the qualified and experienced public sector workers much more too. If you look at Australia and New Zealand as two models of many models, Singapore too, you can add them. The public sector employees are well paid, but the average number of hours in Singapore is 14 and a half. In Malaysia is 16 now. Some people say we don't have the culture for that, but guess what? They are getting ahead. Singapore, for more than 20 years now, is a surplus generating country, to the extent that their entire public sector will be on performance incentive pay soon. They have already begun with the permanent secretaries, who are the head of the civil service in terms of each ministry. So they are successful examples. Jamaica is nowhere near Singapore or New Zealand or Australia. But guess what? I have seen significant difference here in only 10 years than the Barbados, the Trinidad, or the Eastern Caribbean states. So it can be done.
And on that absolutely optimistic note, thank you very much, Dr. Kerr. What you're saying is we need to professionalize a lot of our state-owned enterprises. We need to pay people. We need to find nationals from the region and employ them, bring them home, ensure that they can make a contribution. You're also saying that there are several models available that we could use as guidelines, as guideposts. And I want to congratulate Jamaica on the good work that you're doing and the reform that you have been doing. So thank you very much, Dr. Vindel Kerr, governance specialist, governance expert. Thank you for being on Demming Chronicles. We'll be back with you shortly when we continue the conversation with Allison Demas. Demming Chronicles. Welcome back to Demming Chronicles Season 2, and I take great pleasure in introducing my next guest, Allison Demas. Alison, what, as a Caribbean person, what brings you joy?
Oh, what brings me joy is waking up in the mornings to sunshine and warmth, and even when it's raining, it's warmth. And I just feel really privileged when I see what's going on in the world, to being born and to live in the Caribbean. I've been really fortunate in that, growing up, I was born in Trinidad. My mother's Jamaican, lived in Jamaica for a while, spent about 5 years in Guyana. I've also lived in Barbados. So that I feel really passionate about Caribbean integration. I'm not fooling myself. I know that, federation is perhaps not a reality, But I certainly think we need to continue to work towards much more cooperation and be more integrated, because in unity, there's definite strength.
So you're a real Caribbean person, grounded,
yes, definitely.
And
Grounded.
enjoying every moment of it.
Yes, certainly.
Tell me something about.
In spite of all the, the isms, we have racism, classism, sexism, and from what Dr. Kerr was saying, we still have nepotism, state enterprise sector, the public sector. But you know what? I find it's not as vicious, because I've also lived in the UK as well as in the USA, and it's not as vicious. So I still think there's an advantage in living in a Caribbean environment.
Well,
all our challenges.
A lot of us are still here and are quite grounded here. And what many of us do is what you have done. You've attempted to run your own business here. So tell me something about your business. What do you do?
Okay, so my business, Media Insite, we are a media monitoring company. And when I started, it was nearly 10 years ago. And, I would tell people, I'm into media monitoring. And they would look at me with like this glazed look on their eyes. But in essence, what is media monitoring? It means that we let you know what people are saying about your brand, what they're saying about your competitors, what they're saying about your particular industry or topic across all media channels, whether they be traditional, whether they be digital, social.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of advertising, we also let you know whether you are getting your money's worth, and we also let you know how you're measuring up against your competitors. And what's unique about us is that we monitor more Caribbean media content than any other media monitoring entity globally. So we really focus on the Caribbean.
Lovely. Alison, permit me a little story. When I first started in public relations, our media monitoring was to cut out mention papers. And to see it has moved from that to now a whole online activity in which you can get social media as well. But tell me, how does media monitoring impact decision-making for business?
It impacts decision-making in respect of two fields, in respect of marketing and in respect of communications. So what I mean exactly, in terms of marketing, with media monitoring, advertising monitoring, you're able to see what are the trends in your particular market, country, or industry. You can see, for example, what we're noticing now is the trend is moving from traditional media. We're seeing more activity in terms of digital marketing. And that, of course, is a direct correlation as well, as we're seeing a move in media consumption. So, for example, newspapers have been really affected, and newspaper advertising has certainly plummeted Trinidad and Tobago, especially over the last 5 years, and 2020 has certainly taken the deepest dive, especially in the second quarter. And therefore, it's important to know, what's the volume of mentions that your brand is generating. What are people saying? Is it being portrayed in a negative light, a positive, or a neutral? If it's negative, for example, if you're in the midst of a crisis, a communications crisis, then you can, once you have a communications expert like yourself, Denise, you can detect, okay, what are people saying and what strategy I need to come up with to counter that negativity, for example. You can also see who are your influencers, who are the voices of authority who are speaking about your brand or maybe your competitors. Mm-hmm. So media monitoring really helps you to make those critical, effective, and strategic decisions when it comes to marketing and communications.
Yes. Social media is now a go-to space that a lot of people would do social media advertising.
Yes.
There's two two areas of that I would want us to consider. One of them is that I have had clients who've said to me, I don't need a separate entity to do media monitoring or social media monitoring. I can get my people to do that. I want you to comment on that. And then the second thing I want you to comment on is the new jobs that are being opened up as a result of this technological approach to media monitoring.
Yes, certainly. So, Denise, up to about, I would say 3-4 years ago, you still had companies who would employ people simply to do what you said, was done years ago, reading newspapers and clip out the articles and put them in a folder, right?
Yes.
But, you can make more productive use of people's time rather than doing that. And let's stick with traditional media for now, all right? Let's take Trinidad and Tobago. For example, there are about 36 radio stations. Are you going to be able to use someone's valuable time in your company for them to be listening to all those stations at the same time? How effectively can you do that, right? Even in terms of television, you're going to have people watch television, all day, or even if they just watch it, let's say in the evening, in the night, it's really not efficient. And therefore, that's why, you need a media monitoring company that can use digital technology, audio fingerprinting, to be able to track and record all those various mentions or all the advertisements. And in terms of social media, of course, I'm sure we're familiar with the concepts of social listening. And one of the great advantages is that certainly social media, each social channel generates its own data and analytics and metrics. So, sure, you can, keep track of how you are performing, of your engagement, your reach, your impressions, and so on each of your channels. But if you want now to have a much wider view of the competitive landscape, and perhaps not just only in Trinidad and Tobago, but if, for example, we have lots of companies here that have operations across the region, also certainly more than one country in the Caribbean. And whilst you find all the global leaders in media monitoring, the meltwaters and so on, sure, they have a lot of global content, but you find that sometimes you don't have sufficient Caribbean content. So to get that, holistic, we call it a 360-degree view of your media across the Caribbean, that's why, you need media monitoring and social listening tools.
Wonderful. Tell me something about the kinds of new jobs that are available, or if not available, but just that exist in that area. Because a lot of young people would be looking, they're technologically very savvy. It's nature for them, the technology space. What are some of those jobs that are in existence?
Sure. Well, certainly the large companies, they would have what they call market intelligence and segments departments, where you would have people who would actually take all the analytics and matrix generated by media content and analyze them. And then even in terms of, media monitoring. So instead of having to, let's say clip newspaper articles or even ads in newspapers now, you can use technology like OCR, right? Where you have specialized software programs that young people are adept at using, or even in terms of broadcast, we use specialized as well as our own homegrown technology. And it's interesting, for example, 95% of my employees are millennials, So I think that, definitely, media monitoring, social media, there's a lot of scope.
Yes. And I just want to switch topics a little bit now. Have you noticed any changes since COVID? What impact COVID has had on that industry?
Okay, well, certainly in terms of advertising, it had a huge impact. We saw that, if we look at over the last 5 years, we've seen that advertising has dropped in terms of spend as much as about 50%. And what we noticed, there was a drastic drop in second quarter of 2020. And even though, yes, there was a slight rebound, let's say in Q4, it still didn't reach the levels that it had done in 2019. And then when we look at some of the large advertisers, for example, the commercial banks, insurance companies, retail furniture and appliances, it's interesting to note the different patterns. So for example, Republic Bank, they had a massive increase in their Facebook advertising activity, particularly in the last quarter of 2020. And then we see, for example, in insurance, there are some brands, for example, Maritime is a leader when it comes to Facebook advertising in insurance. But when you look at, across radio, television, and newspaper, they're, not in the top 10, for example. Yeah. So we definitely see that trend, like I said, towards social media advertising. And even in terms of media coverage, but throughout, COVID or coronavirus really dominated the news coverage. Of course, it reached its peak in around, March, April. And what was interesting, I looked at some of the online trends. So for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, the Express led in terms of the physical newspaper. They had about 52% of their front page stories was about COVID. Whereas when we look at the online versions, we had the Newsday leading with the most stories about COVID. So it has definitely impacted advertising and news coverage. But what has also impacted, of course, is how we now consume media. With so many of us working from home, working remotely, we definitely see an increase. People are looking at Netflix. I mean, who's really looking at the TV news? We definitely see an increase in podcasts. And expect that, we will soon have advertising in the Caribbean based on, podcast activity. We see, of course, young people, Instagram, and of course, teenagers, TikTok. So there are, I think, much more avenues for marketing and communications professionals to be able to convey their messages. I think it's a very exciting period that we're witnessing.
So on that note, Alison, I'm not asking you to give free advice, but what would you recommend to, let's say, the medium-sized businesses in terms of their strategy? Should it be online? Should it be traditional? What should it be? What should they be looking at?
Well, I think it all depends on your demographic and the audience, who you're trying to target. What's interesting is that, people think that Facebook is for old people. No, but you have a significant amount. I found this interesting, of baby boomers on Facebook, and they tend to have the largest, consumer spend. So I think it really depends on the target, but we definitely have to perhaps have a mix, again, depending on your audience. So for example, if you have a product that's geared towards, teenagers, well, it's no sense, looking at traditional media and perhaps not even, Facebook. You're definitely going to look at like TikTok and Instagram. So I think it's, you have to know your audience. You have to know who you're targeting and be able to come up with, the right mix.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, thank you very much.
I think that's the important point,
Because what we've talked about is the transition, the changes between traditional media and social media. And we have just been discussing that we really need to segment our audiences, to target people specifically for whatever our product is. And the time that we see people trying to use social media and trying to do media monitoring, oftentimes is when they have a crisis.
Yes.
They're suggesting that we need to do it before we have the crisis.
Exactly. In fact, you have to do it to know when the crisis is about to loom.
Yes, because the Monitoring will tell you that something is happening.
Exactly.
And once you are able to sense that, then you are able
Yes.
to respond to it. So
Yes.
on that note, thank you ever so much, Alison, for being part of Demming Chronicles.
Thank you, Denise.
Today's program, we spoke with Vindel Kerr and Allison Demas of Media Insite. It's been a program that has extended the conversation. We've expanded some of the topics that we need to be looking at. And next time, we'll be continuing the conversation as we aim to make season 2 focus on things that are and will make a difference to the kind of business and quality of life in Trinidad and Tobago. Demming Chronicles. See you next time, and until then, be safe.